Hey guys, I want to let you know real quick that the Mic Drop YouTube page now has a Mic Drop Clips page. It's clips only. It's the super short stuff for those of you that don't want to spend 5 hours listening to an entire long form podcast episode. We've got all the highlights, the clips, the bonus footage, even some stuff that's not on the podcast that didn't make the cut for Patreon. So go to Mic Drop Clips on YouTube. Check it out. Hope you enjoy it. And please support by hitting that subscribe button as well as liking anything that we post. One of the big reasons I wanted to bring you on was talking about some of these fentanyl-based weapons that Iran has been developing, and you've gotten exposure or knowledge through different sources to that. I would love for you to kind of talk about it because it's something that I've not seen really at all in the media.
Very little has been written about it. It is very much a developing story. The potential, high potential of Iran having developed.
So they dropped this fentanyl bomb in, and they thought, well, what will happen is these people go to sleep. And they killed almost everybody.
The Department of Homeland Security may be considering classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. High toxicity and increasing availability could make it an appealing option for a chemical weapons attack.
So very easy to get, very cheap to get. Synthetic typically comes from factories in China. This is a legitimate pharmaceutical product, but that drug is different when it's used sort of in this context.
I think to me the most frightening part about that is getting it into water supplies using drones, right? The mechanism with which it's deployed.
You can aerosolize or gas fentanyl very easily.
It opens up this Pandora's box of capability to administer it in ways that really I don't think a lot of people understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very efficient, very, in many ways, undetectable way to inflict a lot of damage.
I am curious about your work in Sudan, what you were doing there and what took place.
The stories, that came out of there are just some of the worst that I've ever heard in my career. A lot of people killed, the sexual violence, the inhumanity. It's a very resource-rich area, so there's a lot of gold, there's a lot of things that the outside world wants. They will kill children, they will kill babies, they will basically cut limbs off people, women. Their ability to just dehumanize a population to such a degree, I think I came back extremely angry, just with the world and with myself, with everything. And I'd never been someone that had intense anger before. And I ended up going to, at the insistence of a friend, going to Mexico and doing this Overgain, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Oh, yeah.
And it was terrifying kind of thing, but it was probably the most life-changing thing I'd ever done in my life. I don't think I would have a daughter. I don't think I would have any of those things if I hadn't done that, because it just made me see life through this completely different lens.
Ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome my next guest back to the podcast. Third time's a charm. You're originally on episode 69 and 81, so you've visited 2 of the 3 studios that we've had. You're a geopolitical analyst and journalist, a war reporter, author, and international humanitarian, a former international affairs and war correspondent for Fox News Digital, host of the Dispatches on Parenting Across Cultures podcast, which now that you're a new mom, I'd love to get a little bit into that. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for the 3rd time, Hollie McKay.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I know you have a family now and made a weekend out of coming. You mentioned before we started recording that you're going to hit the Texas rodeo, which is pretty cool. I'll be curious to see what the difference is between Australia and Texas rodeo-wise, but if you can even remember, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's been a long time.
Yeah. So one of the questions I like to ask everybody is what the last full book that they read is. I'm especially curious with you being so kind of ingrained into the geopolitics, being an author yourself. Do you read a lot, and what is the last thing that you read?
I do read a lot. I tend to reread a lot too. I try to do, I am big on Kindle now because it's an app on my phone. When I'm traveling, I can highlight passages, I can go back to them. So I have transferred over a lot from the physical book. I also love audiobooks when I'm on the go, so there's always kind of a multitude of things happening. The last full book is one I read many times. I usually read it once every year or every 2 years, and it's John Hersey, Hiroshima.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's a short read. It was a journalist who went back to Japan in the 1950s, so several years after the end of the Second World War, and just interviewed people about their experiences, where things were at, what they remember. And it's really bone-chilling, and it was something I read as a teenager, and that's really what made me want to be a writer in many ways, because he was just able to capture experiences, these human experiences, in a way that I'd never read before. And so whenever I'm feeling stuck in my writing or not sure if I want to keep doing this, whatever it may be, I go back to that book.
Yeah. When you say bone chilling, is the influence from that book, does it kind of encapsulate your style of writing, or the desired outcome of what the reader of the things that you write?
I think it's a narrative. It's almost like reading a fiction book in a nonfiction manner.
Okay.
So it's this ability to take experiences or a situation and write it in a way as if you were reading something fiction, but remembering that it's nonfiction, and humanizing something that, in our case is history, but really bringing it in front of you and confronting, and it makes you think about things in an entirely different way. And I think with my writing, it's not about shoving something down your throat or telling you what to believe or even really analyzing something. It's trying to bring to life that human experience.
Yeah. Wow. Do you find that, or did you find being interested or fascinated by World War II as a child, kind of growing up? Was that something you were into?
Yeah, I did. My grandfather, my dad's father, fought he was in the Australian Army, and he went to Papua New Guinea in, I think it was 1941, and spent sort of through to the end of the war, and came back and then met my nana. She was 16 at the time, or 15 at the time maybe, and they ended up getting married, and it didn't last long, but he left as a child and was a terrible alcoholic, and so he died at the age of, I think it was 41, of alcohol poisoning. He was drinking methylated spirits. So my nana would tell me these stories, and it was funny, but I would see the impact that had on my father growing up. And he never really knew his father, but yet I think there was so much longing there to have had a father. And to this day, every Anzac Day, my dad goes in the parade, wears those ribbons, and he's so proud of what his father did, even though he never knew him. And so I think hearing those stories from my nana, hearing how the war had affected him, and my nana would tell me about, he would just have these episodes of remembering, like, seeing some of these local women in Papua New Guinea and how they were, would have their breasts cut off, or they'd be just this sort of mutilation that was happening, from the Japanese army at the time, and the impact that it had on him as a young man, and really, to his death. And so I always understood that war had this massive impact, and that the Second World War had this massive impact. But I do remember as a child thinking, I think it was in the 90s, I would have been looking at something on the television, I think it was Bosnia, and just being so shocked that this actually still happened.
Yeah.
Because in my childhood mind, it was something that belonged to the history books. And, like, how can you look at World War II and ever think that was going to happen on any scale again? Because haven't we evolved since then? And that was a really, I guess, loss of naivete moment for me, realizing that war still continued outside this, beautiful little Australian bubble that I lived in.
Yeah. I imagine that has continued significantly, spending so much time in Afghanistan and covering some of the Syria stuff, and more recently Somalia, correct? Is it?
I was covering Sudan.
Sudan, that's right. Papua New Guinea is one of the things, I think, at least here in the United States, that as it relates to World War II, you don't hear much about. And obviously it's close to Australia, and but there was a pretty significant amount of World War II took place there in terms of Japan.
It was actually, the first time that the US and Australian armies worked together. That was the first mission, I believe.
Yeah. I wish that here we covered it more, I guess, because it's something that's not talked a lot about. What's something you wish you were better at?
Oh my gosh, so many things. I really wish I was better at languages. It's funny. It's one thing I think it's really hard to pick them up later in life.
Yeah.
That's one thing with my daughter. I really do want her to learn a language when she's a child, because it's hard to do later in life. And I think because I'm so vested in the English language, as a writer, I'm trying to always find the best way to convey something in English. It's not the most second nature thing to pick up languages for me, and I really wish I was better at that.
What if you could pick, or maybe you will pick, I guess, if you're going to have your daughter learn something super young, what would be your first pick language-wise for her to learn?
I think Spanish is useful living in the U.S. My partner Ryan speaks Spanish, so I think that's very useful. But I think more than that, I'd love for her to pick, what she finds interesting. Maybe she wants to speak Japanese. Maybe she wants to speak Italian. I think it would be fascinating just when she's old enough to just ask her what she wants to learn.
Yeah, that's a good approach, I think. If time travel were possible, where and when would you go and why?
Time travel. Oh, my goodness. Can I go to the future?
Yeah, you can go anywhere.
I always let's go forwards, not backwards, even though I think so much of history is fascinating. Yeah, I'd accelerate a decade, more than a decade, 100 years in the future and just see where we're at.
It's kind of frightening to think if you look at the last 20 years of how many technological advances.
Yeah. I remember starting my career, and I started it, when digital was becoming a thing, and it wasn't. That was in 2006, and digital news wasn't even a thing then. It was just beginning. There was no, social media beyond MySpace, and it sort of turned into a very different career than I would have expected back then, almost 20 years ago.
What's something you wish you enjoyed more?
I wish I enjoyed just sitting more. I wish I enjoyed not doing anything more. Just being able to sit on the floor on the weekend and not think about work or do work, and just be in the moment, whatever that is, and not feel like I have to be productive all the time, because I do that. I feel like I need to be productive or thinking about, what is next? What do I need to do? And I think we lose the moment. And it's something I'm aware of, something I'm working on, is to just be in the moment.
Yeah. Hey guys, I want to take a minute to tell you about the Mic Drop Patreon, where you can get the real mic drop experience the way it's meant to be seen. You get completely uncensored, unfiltered, and uncut episodes with nothing held back, just raw, real conversations directly from me to you, without YouTube censorship. Plus, you'll see it days before anyone else, with early premieres and exclusive bonus content that you won't find anywhere else. You get behind-the-scenes access to the show, including pre- and post-show footage, with me and the guest both in studio and on location, depending on what the guest is into and what we have going on. On top of that, we've got tons of Patreon-only perks, mic drop swag, access to exclusive merch, and the chance to submit your questions to be asked at the end of every episode. You'll also get a sneak peek at our upcoming guests, so you'll know who's in the studio weeks before anyone else. We're constantly releasing new features and dropping new content based on what you want to see. For our top tier members, you get the same Mic Drop Challenge coin that all of my guests receive from the upcoming show, which will never ever be for sale. We've got quarterly merch that's sent out directly to you, a monthly Zoom call with me where we talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, and an active group chat where we all shoot the shit on a daily basis. All of that for just a few bucks a month to support the show. Right now, we're also offering a 10% discount off an annual subscription, which means that you get more than a free month. I want to say thank you to everyone who has already signed up. Your support means that we get to keep bringing you the content that you love. So if you haven't yet, hit the link in the description or go to patreon.com/micdrop and join the team. I'll see you guys in there. Thank you. When hunting isn't about hunting at all, Team Dog features comprehensive and customizable meal plans with dry and raw food options to meet your dog's unique nutritional needs, including digestive sensitivities, allergies, or selective eating. Did you know combining 75% dry food with 25% raw food delivers robust, nutrient-dense meals for your dog? Be your dog's hero with Team Dog. Do you have a favorite quote?
Do I have a favorite quote? Gosh, I have so many. I have mantras, I guess, that I give, to myself. And usually something I do at the end of every year is, what mantra do I want for that following year? And I always try to make myself come up with something else. So it's not necessarily a quote, but I think this year, the one that I gave myself was to let it be. Because I think sometimes or oftentimes we're always pushing for the next thing. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. now. It's this sort of terrifying hustle culture at times. And I think we focus so much on what the end goal of things is that we miss where we are. And sometimes letting go of the things that we want and just letting life be, things happen. The universe has a way of bringing things to us as they're meant to be. And I think stopping and recognizing that is really important.
Yeah. Seems like a big shift for you personally into kind of intentionality. Do you think that having a child now has spawned some of that? Or?
Absolutely. It's been a big part of it. I think since we spoke last, it's been a couple of years, there was a lot of, and I just come back from Afghanistan, I think, after that. And then not long after that, I went, I think it was later that month, I believe that was January, I went to do some work in Europe and ended up going to Ukraine, and I stayed there for several months. Obviously, an invasion that I didn't expect to happen happened. And it was, a very trying time, to say the least. And I think I came back extremely angry, just with the world and with myself, with everything. And I'd never been someone that had intense anger before. And I ended up going to, at the insistence of a friend, going to Mexico and doing this Obergain, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, it was a terrifying kind of thing, but it was probably the most life-changing thing I'd ever done in my life. I don't think I would have a daughter. I don't think I would, have any of those things if I hadn't done that. Because, again, it just had been many, many years of back to back to back to back, going to places, listening to just the worst of the worst. And you get sort of sucked into that world a lot. And it's hard to operate outside of that. It's hard to be, coming back to the US was hard for me because there was always something else going on, somewhere I needed to be. And, that was a dangerous, slippery slope, I think, for me. And the Obergain, it's hard to put into words. I have written about it, but it just made me see life through this completely different lens. It made me see the people in my life through a completely different lens. It made me understand myself with just a sense of compassion. And it gave me, at that point in time, a much greater compassion for the world, for the people around me, and I think obviously most importantly for myself. And you were going through events in your life and remembering things, and it's crazy, the ability to remember things that is in your mind, like memories from childhood, people from my childhood. And it's a long experience. You're in it for 15 hours, and it can be terrifying. You're throwing up, you're laughing, you're crying. It's everything all at once. And then there's so much to process after that. But I think for me, it just gave me this almost rewiring of my brain and this totally different perspective on the way that I saw the world. And that was sort of the fundamental driver, I think, for me. And obviously I've continued to do my work abroad, but I think I do it now with, a much different lens. I did before.
And so I've interviewed a number of individuals that have gone through that process, and there's two things that have kind of stood out to me in terms of that experience. While they're all different, there's a commonality in one way that I'm curious if you experience the same thing, which is that they basically kind of relived their entire life up until that point, almost like they're watching a movie and by chapter. Did you experience that same thing?
Absolutely. It was, everyone's experience is different, but my experience, throughout this was a sort of a game show host. And he was basically like, let's go through your life. And
Steve
literally
Harvey.
My brain, it was kind of a Steve Harvey figure, I'm not lying. And it was like my brain, I could see my brain and him just like pulling cards out of like the crevices in my brain and being like, let's look at this. Let's look at this. And I was, having memories of, babysitters that had taken care of me as a 3-year-old that I'd sort of forgotten from my life. Conversations with people in my life that had passed that maybe I never got to really say proper goodbye to. It was just, it was life-changing in so many ways. And it just, as I said, I felt like I came out of that with a new brain, as a new person, as an ability to see things in a way that I couldn't.
And would you say that the impact that had and the changes that it made to you, that they're permanent, that they've stuck, or have they weaned at all since you've gone through it?
I think I would say majority of it is permanent and stuck. I think I'm still human.
Yeah.
So I have my moments, but I think I'm much more aware of them now when I feel like I'm not acting rationally or I'm being unfair in a situation where, I might be upset about something. I think what it's given me is a tool to be like, okay, let's look at it from that person's point of view here, or know when to walk away. And not get myself angry and rattled the way that I used to. Like I remember just finding, sitting in my apartment, I think it was after when I came back from Ukraine, and just being just so angry. And thinking, this isn't right. Like, this is not a way that I can live my life. And I definitely I get upset about, situations in the world that bother me, but I don't get angry in that sort of deep-seated way anymore, because I recognize that isn't productive into helping the situation, and that's not going to help me move forward. But I would be open to doing it again at some point in my life. I don't know that I feel like I have to, but I think there's so much we learn about each other and learn about ourselves. I feel like, if you're well and healthy, it's not something you want to do unless you have a good heart and you're good to go. But I think it's just so much we can all learn, just about ourselves. Even if you think that you have, no trauma or no great things to unravel, there's so much about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, from a percentage standpoint, did most of the things that the cards that the game show host is pulling out, were they things that you hadn't remembered? Like, were most of them memories that you had forgotten, or was it a mix of?
Yeah, I think most of them were things that I had forgotten, that I just, thought that I had no reason to remember or think about. Yeah. And sort of pulling them out made me question, well, why is this a significant memory to me? Why am I thinking about this experience? And I think with, a lot of the caretakers or the people that are taking care of me, I think that was a reminder to me that you have people around you that love you, that want to take care of you, and you've always had that. And so I think, that is a source of comfort. There was also experience of sort of seeing my parents in younger years, and giving me, seeing my mother as a child, my father as a child, and giving me so much more compassion for their own life experiences. And, for them, you can be angry. We're all angry at our parents to some degrees, but for what that they gave me that I wasn't appreciating, given that their lives growing up were much harder than my life growing up. Both my parents came from very poor backgrounds, extremely poor backgrounds, and, what they'd built to give my sister and I the best possible life they could, and how much I took that for granted. Yeah. So I think, when we see people we love, especially as children, you can't help but recognize the vulnerabilities, and that as children, we're all innocent human beings.
Yeah. It's really a fascinating process. Like I said, I know a ton of people that have done it, and there's really only one instance where a guy I know said, I didn't really get anything out of it,
It took me 2 goes.
Oh, really?
So I did, I was sort of staying there for a week, I think. And then the first time I did, and, I flood dosed because the place I was at, everybody else there was there because they were at their last straw of a drug addiction. So really, deep meth addicts, people that were there and that just were this was their last resort, basically. They'd been to every rehab possible and nothing was sticking. So, and all lovely people. And so they could only do very monitored microdosing. Whereas me, I wasn't on anything, I could just blood dose it. And so the first time, I didn't really get anything out of it. That first night, that I did it, it was just chaos in my brain, basically. And I was like, I can't make sense of any of this. This is chaos. I want nothing to do with this. And then I gave it a couple of days and I almost didn't do it again. And I thought about it. I thought, you know what? You're here to get something out of it. Let's just do this again. So I think between that and probably still being in my system and then adding to it, and again, I think the dosing thing is so individual too. And I found that I probably needed to take more than maybe other people did. And so it was the second time that I did it a couple of days later that I had that breakthrough.
Yeah. Do you know if that's a fairly common response, that people need to do it more than once like that?
Yeah, I would say if you didn't get anything out of it the first time, don't give up.
Yeah. Were any of the moments legitimately scary?
I didn't find, I found myself, feeling sick and physically, but I don't think mentally in my head that I found any of it scary. Yeah. And I think prior to that, a year or so prior to that, I guess, I had tried the 5-MeO DMT, and I found that experience incredibly scary, incredibly out of my body, incredibly chaotic and awful and panicked. And I never wanted anything to do with that because I really hated that experience. And so I think that taught me that the ability, you've got to stay calm with it. You've got to go with it. I had a friend of mine, he was actually a former team guy, and he said to me before I did it, you've just got to be okay with dying. And it was actually the best advice anyone could have given me because I'd learned from that experience and then from, his experience doing it and those words, you've got to be okay with dying. So you can't panic. You can't go in there and want to get out of it because once you're in, you're in. So you just got to ride it out. There's no quick fix to get it out of your system. You've got to go. So I think having that knowledge enabled me to relax my way through it and be open to just tell me what I need to know. And I think you have to go into it knowing that you are going to be totally out of control. Your body almost goes back to this infantile state where you can't really control your limbs. I remember trying to crawl to get to the bathroom. You're going to be totally out of control, and you just got to be okay with that and know that it will come to an end. And I think the time that I tried it before, it was the biggest fear was this will never end. And I think taking that knowledge in again and being it will end, but you've just got to go through it before it will.
Yeah.
And so I felt much more sort of evolved going into it.
Yeah. Guys and gals, you spend roughly a third of your life sleeping. It continues to astound me how few people actually prioritize the mattress that they're sleeping on and how important it is in terms of contributing to a good night's sleep. I recently got the Helix Dusk Elite. I did get the king size because I do like to stretch out. And I got to tell you, it's an absolute life-changing experience. From a comfortability standpoint, it's comfortable while still being firm. And I got, about the best night of sleep I've ever gotten once I started sleeping on it. I've tried everything out there, whether it's, ones that you can adjust the firmness setting to ones that are supposed to be cooling. Everything in between. And I've always struggled with being able to get a good night's sleep on a mattress that was both comfortable and firm enough to not make my back feel like I slept in a hammock. I cannot recommend the Helix brand as a company, and their mattresses are amazing. They're 100% waterproof. You can keep them fresh and clean throughout the entire life of the mattress, and it's been an absolute game changer for giving me the ability to recover, wake up fresh for the next day to come do a podcast, workout, work dogs, you name it. Helix mattresses are my go-to brand for a good night's sleep. Go to helixsleep.com/micdrop for 27% off site-wide, plus 2 free Dream pillows with the mattress purchase and free bedding bundle. It's 2 Dream pillows, sheet set, mattress protector with any Luxe or Elite mattress order. That's helixsleep.com/micdrop for 27% off site-wide, plus 2 free Dream pillows with the mattress purchase and a free bedding bundle. That's 2 Dream pillows, sheet set, mattress protector with any Luxe or Elite mattress order. helixsleep.com/micdrop. Did you know that high blood pressure is one of the highest risk factors for mortality? In fact, 1 in 2 adults have high blood pressure. That is a 50-50 chance that you're a walking time bomb. However, you, not Big Pharma, can help take control of your blood pressure before it's too late. With 120 Life. 120 Life is a blend of great tasting superfruit juices that can actually help lower your blood pressure. 120 Life is formulated with ingredients that have been shown to naturally help control high blood pressure and are endorsed by thousands of health professionals. You can try it yourself risk-free with their 2-week trial pack. Just go to 120life.com and use the code DROP, all caps, all one word, DROP, to save 15% and receive free shipping. They are so sure that 120 Life can noticeably lower your blood pressure in 2 weeks that they'll give you your money back if you're not satisfied. 120 Life offers a risk-free trial with a full refund if you don't see lower numbers in 2 weeks. There's nothing to lose except your high blood pressure numbers. 120 Life is trusted by healthcare professionals with hundreds of doctors recommending it to help manage blood pressure naturally. It's not just for high blood pressure. It's also helpful for those managing diabetes. 120 Life provides visible, measurable changes in blood pressure, and you can use a simple monitor at home to track your progress. Thousands have benefited from 120 Life. It's a choice you can trust for your health. So you have nothing to lose but those high blood pressure numbers. Go to 120life.com. That's 120life.com. And remember to use the code DROP, D-R-O-P, to save 15%. This is serious. It's your life you're talking about. 120 Life can help. These statements have not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. It's such a fascinating process. I find myself considering it. I do tend to feel like I fall in that category, and that I don't feel like I need to. And I don't think that I'm trying to talk myself out of going and doing it. There's no aspect of my life that I feel traumatized by or that I dwell on often or interpersonal problems with anybody in my life. So I'm not opposed to doing it. I guess it seems like it's such a powerful experience that, from my perspective, and maybe I'm looking at it wrong, but from my standpoint, it seems like it should be something you feel like you need to go do and not just like, well, I'll give it a shot.
I didn't think I needed it either. And if it wasn't for a friend insisting, like, I will have someone come and pick you up from LAX and drive you over the border, and like, I'm going to make this easy for you.
Yeah.
And I only justified doing it to myself by, I'm going to write about it then.
Oh.
That was my only justification. I wasn't just going to go and like do it because I felt that I needed it, because I didn't think I needed it, even though I knew that I wasn't in the best mental shape, but I wasn't going to go do it otherwise. And I mean, afterwards, one of the guys said to me, what was this like? And I thought of all the places I'd been and all the experiences I'd had, that was by far the most fascinating life experience.
That says a lot.
At that point, before having my daughter, which is a whole other fascinating experience.
Yeah.
But
that says a lot, though. I mean, because you've been, in terms of experiences that you've had contrasted to most people, you could write 10 books about everything you've gone through. I am curious, is there from your perspective, an age that you should at least be before you do it?
It comes from Gabon in Africa, and they do it as like a rite of passage at 11, 12 years old. I wouldn't recommend that young, but I guess they're they get you ready for adulthood in that way. With these things, I mean, the brain doesn't fully develop until 25. So I'd be hesitant to say doing it under 25 just because your brain is still developing. But somebody who has gone through, heavy trauma younger in life, they may need it earlier.
Yeah.
And that's, and that, again, my experience of being there, it wasn't just about that. It was, being with, spending a week with people who were, again, severe addicts, heroin, meth. And it also gave me a lot more, and I always had compassion for addiction, but I think it gave me a lot more compassion for the people that were going through this and suffering and trying to find their way out of it. And this was sort of the end of the rope. And for some of them, it's worked. Several of them have died since then.
So
a good, at least 4 of the people that I spent time with have died since then.
from overdosing?
From a lot of them got clean. The irony of it is that they got clean, and then it's just that one time. Yeah. That one time you overdose, it's fentanyl. It's just, and it also it brought to light to me just the strength of addiction, of what it does to people that otherwise had good lives. A lot of them, they came from good families. They had good opportunities. Maybe they fell down that path one time and then it was just an absolute slippery slope from there. Yeah. And it really broke my heart because just really kind, loving people who just were struggling to find their way out.
Yeah. I do wonder on the point of the, prior to the prefrontal cortex being fully developed at 25, I do wonder if maybe the intent behind having it as a rite of passage prior to that is that maybe it does a remapping of the brain before so that it sets you up for success as an adult, if it maybe creates neural pathways that allow you to come into adulthood in a better way. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a reason that they do it so young. Yeah. In these countries, because I think it can set you up. Yeah. For different things. And it was funny. There was actually, and because it does actually bring your brain back into this sort of childlike state. There was one guy there who was microdosing, and he'd had trauma and experiences before which had led him there, but he was actually microdosing to learn languages because it does bring your brain back into that childlike state. And then, he says it had this ability to make him absorb all these different languages. So
that's dedication to learning languages.
Totally.
I guess. Yeah. So, I mean, you've kind of already caught us up to a certain extent between January of 22 when you were here last and now. For the things that have transpired since then, if you could kind of maybe chronologically walk us through from January of 22 until now, kind of glossing over the things that you've already covered, just to let us know what you've been doing since then. Yeah.
So I mean, the biggest change, I guess, in that was having Raven in September of 23. But before that, I was still have still been traveling. So prior to that, I was doing work in Iraq. I had gone back to Ukraine several times, especially during the time that the Wagner Group was, taking Bakhmut and parts of that. So I was spending a lot of time there. I guess I was a bit all over the place. I was doing work in Puerto Rico. I was doing work, on all these different ends of the globe. And then since having Raven sort of continued, it's much more strategic now. Work in Sudan. I've done work in India, done work in Saudi Arabia. So it's, it's still happening. It's just much more strategic now.
With the Ukraine stuff, so you were there prior to the invasion.
Yes.
What was the reason for being there? And did you see the invasion coming at all, or did it catch you completely?
It really did catch me by surprise. So I was toying at that point because I had only been back from Afghanistan for a few weeks. And so I was toying, and there was a build-up. There was a lot of talk, like this is going to happen. And I just remember thinking, like, how stupid could you be? Like, how is this... is this hype? What is this? And I was toying, I was going back and forth whether to go or not to go, of like, do I do this? Do I not do this? Like, do I stay and try to decompress a little bit, or do I go? And I ended up having some work offered to do in Tirana, Albania. So I was really going to be in that neck of the woods. That was the end of January. And so I thought, well, I'm already here on this side of the world. Let's just, pop over to Ukraine and see what's going on. And so I did, and I went to some of the eastern places that had been at war since 2014 at that point. And then I remember going back to Kyiv, thinking to myself, like, this is ridiculous. Like how it didn't make sense that it would happen. And then it did. Yeah. It did. So yes, I was absolutely caught off surprise. I think majority of people, other journalists, other people working there were caught by surprise that it had actually happened. And so, when it did, there was so much unknown at the time too, because you feel like you're in the middle of something, but you don't really know what's going on around you per se. And you're looking at social media and there's so much fear and hype, and there's a Russian convoy and it's just outside Kyiv, and any minutes, Kyiv is going to come under attack. And so I think there's just a lot of unknown that went into being there, throughout those first few weeks to months.
What is your understanding of why the invasion happened, contrasted to how it's been reported on?
I think it's super convoluted. I think, you try to look at it from both sides. So obviously, no country wants to be invaded. No, I feel very much for the Ukrainians to have had that happen to them. Taking all the politics out of it, and watching the way that they transformed their country overnight, and that the willingness for everybody to bear arms, to fight, to do whatever they could to prevent Russians from taking over their society, I think was the best of humanity and what you look for when you go to places. And I contrast that experience with Afghanistan, where I'd had that awful, frustrating time in watching the Afghan army run away and Taliban just walk in and there was no sort of opposition to them taking over these places because everyone had run away. And then I went to Ukraine, and you had this opposite experience. It was where, people were, no matter the sort of training and experience. I remember interviewing, the Ukrainian ballet dancers, men and women, that were like, let's leave the ballet company. We're going to get our guns and off we go. It was just, there was no question about it. So I think that no country deserves to be invaded. I think that there are elements that we don't look at all the time about why Russia tried to make that decision. Agreements that had been made about, not having troops sort of massed around their border. There are a lot of nuances that led up to that invasion that I think in hindsight, could have been addressed or mitigated or, brought to the forefront, in the years prior to this happening.
If not to say that you would even take the position, but if Putin hired you to be the press secretary on behalf of Russia and tasked you with conveying to the world as to why it's justified that they did what they did, how would you try to position it?
I don't think I could justify what they did. I mean, I could express concern about, foreign troops in Ukraine, close to their border. I could certainly, empathize and understand that would be a concern to us in the United States. But I could never justify, that sort of full-scale war beyond I'm yet to see a war that's, ended better on the other side. So I certainly couldn't justify that to the Russian people.
Yeah. Have you kept in contact with a number of people that you've interviewed? And I mean, do you know a bunch of people that have lost their lives since it started?
In Ukraine?
Yeah.
I've a couple of people that I know that have died, or their partners have died, or had family members that have died. Thankfully, a lot of the people that I've worked with they had medical clinics or NGOs are still able to operate. And they're still going. And a lot of the cases, they've been going since 2014. This isn't entirely new. I mean, it felt new to us, I guess, in 2022, but it had been going on for almost 8 years before that. So in a much smaller scale. But I think there's been, a lot of awful situations. I mean, I've known several people that were held as POWs and that, I mean, the stories that have come sort of out of those experiences too are really shocking and painful. And hard to wrap my head around again at this day and age.
Yeah. Is there something that stands out from an American media standpoint that's the most misrepresented about what's going on there?
I think I'll go back to my last sort of experience there before I was pregnant with Raven was in November of 2022, and I was in Bakhmut, and it was a very, very intense time at that point in time. It was just, constant bombardment. Every structure has been blown out, and a lot of unknown. But the people in the areas, and this was, in Donbass, and the people that were still living there that, were, lighting fires, or there was this one store that was still operating and the whole half of it had been bombed out, and maybe then there was like one shelf and it had some Mars bars and toilet paper and a few things, and they were still running the store because people were still riding their bike in the middle of, all the chaos, just acting like nothing was going on. And the impression that I got from the people there that still wanted to live there, that refused to leave their homes, they would say to me, the Ukrainians are doing this to us. And that wasn't entirely true. If you look at the direction of where the weapon is coming from, it's not coming from Ukraine. But in their eyes, this was, they were Russian. And I think, that part of it may not always be conveyed, that some of these areas that are under bombardment, they're not necessarily pro-Ukrainian places.
Really?
And I know in my experience, I went to Crimea in the beginning of 2017. So this was sort of 3 years after that it was annexed by Russians. And I was very curious to learn about what that takeover looked like. Like, how does someone just come in, these little green men, as it was explained to me, that basically come in, sort of implant themselves, and you're like, who are these people? Why are they here? And then that goes on for several weeks, and then suddenly it's taken over. And so what I found really interesting about that was a majority of people that I interviewed, this is 3 years in, the ones even that were super pro-Ukrainian in 2014, would explain to me that afterwards, when they would try to go and get their passport, or that they were basically treated like shit by Kiev and were like treated as traitors, even though they were pro-Ukrainian. And then on the other hand, they had Russia going, well, here's your passport, here's this, let me help you with this. And, playing the very, welcome game. And so they were like, well, we're going to go this way now because our country's not making it easy for us. And so my worry that I started to hear and still hear in some of those separatist areas is that there is still that same sentiment of you're a traitor, and so, we're not going to make life easy for you, which is so convoluted because, yes, there's probably a good chance that maybe they are pro-Russian, but at the same time, if you want that area as Ukrainian, you've got to make it still welcoming for the people that didn't ask for any of this that's happening. And so I think that nuance is not always conveyed.
Yeah. It's a great point, and I think one that most people lack a very thorough understanding of, myself included. I'm curious to get your take on the United States, what your take is on our involvement there, both financially and, supplying weapons. And do you think that that's a good idea? Do you think we have a responsibility or a kind of a moral obligation to do it? What is your take on our response thus far to the issue in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's been sort of this hard to interpret response because on one hand, yes, the U.S. has come out since the beginning and said we're behind Ukraine, NATO, this can't happen, we can't have Russia taking over Ukraine. But then the Ukrainians weren't necessarily given the full tools that were needed. I don't know that the full tools could have ever been approved. And then we can, dig deep and say, well, this is taking away from very important stockpiles in Europe and the United States. But they weren't given the full tools to win, per se. So given just enough to kind of be in the situation that we're in now, which is a stalemate, that Ukraine isn't winning. It's holding out some areas, but it's not winning. Russia is a much bigger country. It has a much bigger pool of people that it can take from, and, you know, a much stronger military industrial complex. And this was actually another thing that, you know, I found a little bit frustrating too, was that, you know, if you've been at war at that point for 8 years in your country, didn't you want to build up a little bit of your own kind of supplies? And I felt that, you know, that was probably an area that was lacking. And Ukraine really did have to then turn to Europe and allied countries to back them up. And you have had 8 years, and sure, you did something, but it clearly wasn't on a scale of being anywhere near enough. Having said that, extremely resourceful people, civilian sector, being able to, you know, do what they do with drones, and amazing, intelligent people. Back to the U.S. involvement. I do want to see, you know, Ukraine stay Ukraine. I totally don't want it to become a Russian territory. And I think if that was to even the case, you'd be dealing with these constant low-level insurgencies. Ukrainians are just not going to turn around and say, oh, okay, sure, we're going to be all Russia tomorrow. That's never going to happen. But at this point, you know, we're looking at almost 3 years into a war. We're looking at just casualties and deaths that are just hard to wrap heads around. I mean,
Numbers-wise?
It's very hard to pinpoint because now the government is very transparent about it because, you know, for obvious morale reasons. I believe in Russia it's more than over 500,000 dead. And I think in Ukraine you're probably looking at a couple of 100,000, which for a much smaller country is terrifying. And both governments have not mobilized per se, but there's certainly, if you're taking that many of your young, you know, healthy, smart, good men and killing them off in battle, where does that leave, you know, your society, generations? So I think that is hugely problematic, and I don't want to see this continue and just to drag on and on and on and never really get anywhere with it. So I think at some point you have to rattle the cage, and there needs to be some kind of discussion and negotiation. And I don't know how it's going to necessarily feel quote unquote fair. And again, Ukraine, their argument being, you know, why should we have to give up our territory? You've got to go back to, well, sometimes you've got to make the best of the worst choices. And that's what I tell myself a lot, that every choice presented to you can be really shitty. So you got to find what the least shitty choice is and what's going to be in the long run best for your country. Does that mean giving, you know, these separatist areas and severing them off for the sake of stopping, you know, another 100,000, you know, lives? Maybe. And it does. And that's a lot of what negotiations are going to come down to, making the best of the worst decisions.
Yeah. Do you think that the United States should have supported to the degree that we have? Do you think it should be more or less?
I mean, I do think it is Europe's backyard. And, you know, if you could say any one good thing that's come out of, you know, both Trump's rhetoric in his first term and then this happening, is that we have seen the NATO spending go up in a number of countries. You know, not every country, some still fall short, but Poland, other places are far, you know, giving far more than the 2% that is required. And I think some of them are over 5% now. So that's been one, I guess, good thing to finally see some of these NATO countries not just resting on America. I know it's a convoluted issue, but I do think that we should have supported Ukraine, but I think there needs to be a cutoff to how long we can do this for. Yeah. Because it is a sacrifice that Americans make. It's a sacrifice to our own national security because we deplete stockpiles. Europe depletes its own stockpiles, and that's very hard to keep up with. And that's not going to be replenished anytime soon. So I do think support for Ukraine in the beginning, I think, is crucial to let Russia know it can't just walk in and you know, think it can do whatever it wants and there's no kind of repercussion to that. I don't think that puts America in a very strong light. But I think the way to handle it going forward is to know this is not going to go on forever. This is going to be a cutoff time. We need to figure this out before we reach that.
Yeah. I've seen a few different reports from multiple sources kind of lending credibility to Russia being able to have completely overwhelmed the entire country and quote unquote ended it in a matter of days, and they chose not to for whether it's world support of trying not to push that envelope. Do you tend to agree with that, or do you think that they do have their hands full as much as they can stand? And
Yeah, I don't think Russia anticipated it to go on this long either. I think that they thought, we're going to come in, Kyiv is going to crumble pretty quickly, and then we're going to sort of, I guess, revert back to a situation of pre-Maidan Revolution in 2014, where you can put a sort of a Russian puppet in there as president, and you're good to go to serve your interests. And I think that they didn't probably expect the tenacity of Ukrainians themselves. I hand it to them in their ability to totally transform their life overnight. Like, you look out your hotel window and 1 minute the bars are full and life is sort of normal, even though there is this pending threat. The next day it's like there's curfews, there's checkpoints, there's, everybody is suddenly in fatigues, like, alcohol sales and, that in Ukraine to not be able to get your vodka. But, all of that is suddenly like nobody's allowed to buy it because everybody, has to be concentrated and in their, fully functioning faculties to, and it overnight, it just, I have to hand it to them for that, because that's such a big change. And I don't think a country should be able to bully its way in and take over in that kind of manner. Yeah. But it just can't go on and on.
Do you think that Russia underestimated the world's response as well, or do you think that they expected that?
I think they probably, totally underestimated the world's response in that as well, and especially in those early days. But Russia's always been fairly good about navigating around the sanctions. I mean, the biggest tool that the international community, beyond, supplying weapons to Ukraine, is to be able to sanction. But Russia is very... they're able to navigate that. They forged stronger ties with India. And there's a flip side to that too. So there was a lot of heat, if you remember at that time, being on India because they were continuing to buy Russian oil. And, that was sort of seen as a slap in the face to the United States, who has historically, very strong ties with Delhi. But in many ways, had that sort of not happened or that oil flow just stopped, we probably would have seen massive spikes in oil prices as well. And that would have affected you and me and every one of us sort of sitting at home. So there's always more to every story. There's no perfect answer that just fits neatly into a box. There's nuances everywhere. And sometimes they're always hard to convey in 10-second headlines that people read or follow the echo chambers that they want to read. But Russia's been very good about its ability to work around sanctions. And again, I remember being in Crimea, and they said to me, there was a group of people that I met where they called themselves pro-sanction because Crimea had been sanctioned at that point. And I was like, what is that? What is pro-sanction? I've never heard this. And they explained, well, we can't get our cheese from France anymore, so we make our own. We make our own soap, or so it became this like challenge almost to make the best of what they could in-house, where they were no longer reliant upon foreign countries, giving them these certain things. So very resourceful in that way. But I think Russia's been good about being able to kind of work around, keep its economy strong in different sections. But I do think now it's that bubble is starting to burst a little bit. And I think that they've got inflation. They've actually got really low unemployment, which is also problematic because that drives up prices in other ways, labor shortages. And I think that throughout this year, we're going to see the Russian economy bubble burst a little bit. And to whether that makes any difference to, civilians turning on Putin if the war continues, because I guarantee that even if the economy is down, they are still going to be putting money into their military and into this war. That's not going to go away unless there's some kind of deal reached. But whether civilians are going to kind of turn against that sort of is the wild card.
Yeah. In terms of your kind of perception as to how it ends, is that kind of best worst case scenario, how you see it actually coming to a close?
I mean, you can't bomb your way into fixing it at this point. So I think it's going to have to be, Russia's going to have to agree to stop, with a lot of its attacks on the capital and other places. I think it's going to also have to accept it's not going to be able to control who is in power in Kiev, without some sort of legitimate election. And I certainly don't see a Russian puppet being voted in by the Ukrainian people anytime soon. I think Ukraine is going to have to surrender some of that separatist territory. The parts of it, I mean, there's nothing left of it, first of all. I mean, there's nothing left. It's just, it's bombed into oblivion. And I think that Ukraine is going to have to accept that as no longer being Ukrainian territory. Otherwise, she just goes on, tit for tat. And I think just by sheer size, Russia has the advantage of being able to bolster its supplies much more efficiently, bolster the men that it can take men from prisons. It takes men, particularly from rural areas. So St. Petersburg, Moscow, they're not feeling the pinch of this. It's very rural communities that are. So they're going to just be able to sort of keep taking, people, and Putin doesn't care how many people die. He's just going to continue with it. So I think Ukraine's going to have to accept that there's territory that maybe they're not going to be able to reign over. And I think ultimately that's kind of what Russia wants. And at the end of the day, does Kyiv want to continue to fight for parts of land that maybe the majority of people there don't want to be part of them anyway?
Yeah. It's such a tragic scenario. I mean, the numbers are staggering. They're hard to even wrap your mind around.
It is, and just the POWs, the trauma, the humiliation, the abuses. I'll read some of these things or talk to people, and it gives me nightmares.
Yeah, it's bad stuff. Do you have any information, or have you heard of any of some of the claims to our government, certain people in our government at higher echelons being involved in kind of a funneling of money or money laundering through support through Ukraine being kicked back to them? Have you heard of any of that?
Look, yeah, I can't probably speak to that in anything I've heard firsthand, but corruption is everywhere. I mean, Russia is an incredibly corrupt place. Ukraine, historically, incredibly corrupt, and that is one of the big arguments of how much oversight we have or have not had over money, weapons, what actually goes to the battlefield and what doesn't. So I think that those are very legitimate concerns because, as we're seeing now with, exposés on government waste.
Staggering.
It's staggering, but it should come as no surprise, even though it does. But it really shouldn't come as a surprise because this has been the way for a very long time.
Yeah. I guess we'll probably hit some of that towards the end of the show as far as like the USAID stuff and what have you. But I am curious about your work in Sudan. It was pretty significant. And can you kind of walk us through what you were doing there and what took place? Yeah.
So I felt that things that were happening in Sudan were so sort of underreported, particularly the Darfur side of things. Now, a lot of us probably, remember Darfur from the early 2000s when it was a designated genocide. You had militias, a lot of people killed, and then it kind of disappeared after that. The Janjaweed, as they were called at the time, were the rebels. Now pretty much the Janjaweed is rebranded, and it's now the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. And these are Arab militias that, in a nutshell, are in parts of it. Some of them have lived there. Some of them have come from outside. That basically are trying to run as many of the Darfurians, the tribes, in particular the Masalit tribe, a Black African tribe in that area, out of their homeland and take over. It's a very resource-rich area. So there's a lot of gold. There's a lot of copper. There's a lot of things that the outside world wants in that particular region. And so that's really flared. It's sort of flared off and on over the years, those ethnic tensions, but it happened sort of the beginning, I guess, in 23. In that summer of 23, things really flared again, where these militias came in. And this time they didn't just target the rural areas as they had in the past. They went into the cities, into El Janina, into El Fasher. And the war crimes, things coming out of those places, just some of the worst that I've ever heard in my career. And it plagued me, it bothered me that it felt like at that point in time, everything was Middle East and Ukraine. And I think, it's easy to forget there's a whole other world of things that are happening. And much of my work has been driven by trying to bring, a light on some of these things that are happening in the world that maybe aren't always going to be headline news. And so I think for me, for Darfur in particular, and just speaking to people there, and then I just felt that it was a complicated, and Africa is always a really hard place to work. And I always say, any journalist will tell you, there's no harder place to work than Africa. Just
what makes it so
logistically, safety-wise, and oftentimes it's just there's so much wanting money. There's so much, it's hard to get from A to B, without. There's a lot of places that I can go operate with my fixer and me, and I'm good to go. Africa, it's like, depending on where you are, it's just, it can be so dangerous just to go, 10 miles down the road. So it's just a very convoluted place. Everybody wants permission slip. So many layers to it.
Does being a woman make that even more difficult?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It does. I think, it does, because I think unlike, and we can get into this, so unlike someone like Afghanistan, where, yes, it's hard to be a woman in a different way, in the sense that the Taliban might not look at you or disregard you, but you're not necessarily a target in their eyes, so to speak. A Western woman, I'm not necessarily a target to them. I'm just kind of like, who is she? What is, she's in this like weird gray zone. Whereas in Africa, everyone's a target. And women, and one of the things that drove me to want to cover Darfur, are a huge target. And so it does make it, a very challenging place to work. But having said that, I felt very strongly and about covering it. In particular, sort of, I was working sort of Chad-Sudan border, which is just, not far from El Janina, where things were happening, and, mainly focus with a local group that were housing a lot of the displaced people and families, and just kind of going, and I wasn't kind of running around trying to get into the middle of conflict. I was more documenting the experiences of people who had fled to quote unquote relative safety, even though, anywhere anything can happen. But the stories, that came out of there, and the targeting of women, the sexual violence, the way that the inhumanity of what human beings are capable of. It's hard to think that, we're all it was these militias, the RSF, their ability to just dehumanize a population to such a degree, it just, blew my mind.
Are there any examples you could share that, I guess, from an atrocity standpoint, I mean, there's crazy shit going on in Ukraine, there's crazy shit going on in Israel and Gaza, there's, does Darfur kind of separate itself in any way in that regard? Like, is there a specific type that differs? Yeah, I mean, I think, so a lot of it, excuse me, so with the women's stuff, it was, there was no, they will rape children, they will rape babies, they will basically cut limbs off people, women, it doesn't matter. They will, again, this isn't like the worst atrocity in the world, but it just shows you the sense of dehumanization, like taking some of the mass elite, tribes and basically like putting a dog collar on them and making them bark and walk down the middle of the street, refusing to allow anyone to bury the dead, burying people alive, and if anyone was buried, as a sort of a ritual, which is very
important in a lot of societies, particularly in Islamic societies, and then making them go and dig that grave back up again because they are refusing to allow people to, I guess, have that final sense of goodbye. And that was very scarring to people. Just execution, and particularly with the men, they would just, if you were, part of the tribe they didn't like and you were trying to flee, you were going to be lined up and executed. And then, the women, they may or may not let go depending on the situation, but, the more that they could inflict horrific damage on people, then, that's a tool. That's why we say sexual violence is a weapon of war, because that's how it's used as a weapon of war. In other cases, it's impregnating women so that they, that's, I guess, breaking up the ethnic groups, that's causing them to be ostracized from society. In many cases, if that happens, a girl will never get married. She will be completely ostracized for the rest of her life. That damages entire families, communities. I mean, the ripple effects. And this was just a systematic tool, I think, that was just carried out with such, chilling, it was such a chilling approach. And to almost, everyone that you talk to, that it's just hard to, keep thinking that this just goes on while you live a normal life.
Do we have any involvement, the United States?
Not per se. I mean, I was frustrated because the State Department would constantly kind of come out with these statements of blaming both sides. And there's always two sides, yes, to a war. You can't have conflict if it's totally one side. But it's a lopsided agreement. It's a lopsided conflict here. So you can't morally equate, both sides to what's happening. And so I saw a lot of that diplomatic speak. That's frustrating. I think a lot of it, has to do with not wanting to implicate or upset partner countries that may be supplying weapons. Namely the UAE.
Really?
Yeah. And, to a lesser extent, Libya. But they're not getting these weapons. They're not digging them up from their backyard. They're coming in for a particular place and purpose. And that part of it, I don't know that's been fully addressed. Right before Biden left office, Secretary Blinken did come out and declare it a genocide. But I mean, at that point, it was the end of the term, and what more is going to happen after that? So we don't necessarily have any huge stake in that. But I think it's hard to sort of say, yes, this is what's happening, and not trace it back to where weapons are coming from. And I always say, if we want to put a stop to these atrocities that are happening, the genocide, then we need to look at where the money supply, the weapons are coming from. And that is what I'll say is the only way you end that. You can't end that by going in with, some sort of peacemaker, whatever, let's all be friends. You have to cut the weapons supply. And I think that I haven't really seen any action to do that.
So if you kind of dissect geopolitically our involvement in certain areas and our lack of involvement in certain areas, is it that simple? Where if you look at Ukraine and Israel as an example, is that there is no sensitivity to their oppositions of us offending, or there being some sort of tension with a diplomatic handshake, and that's the reason why we're involved in those two places particularly, and don't really have a skin in the game, so to speak.
I mean, to be fair, the U.S. can't, obviously, doesn't have the capacity to be everywhere in the world, and that's not a fair or realistic expectation to have of the U.S. However, I do think, obviously those two get the most attention because they do involve very directly United States tax dollars. I mean, we're funding a lot of what is conspiring there. So in that directly, has an effect on the United States. So I think in that sense, yes, I mean, it comes down to what is a monetary reason. And I'm definitely not saying that let's, go into Sudan. I don't think that is the answer by any means. But I think putting pressure on allies, supplying weapons. They make a big difference. Publicly condemning can make a big difference. The US has a lot of cards to play in many different ways. And some of that leverage, it doesn't have to be that complicated to use.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to understand why we really give a shit what the UAE thinks about us having a stronger stance than that. Do you know what that would be?
It's financial. I mean, they're a big purchaser of United States military weapons. They are a key ally in the Middle East, but there has to be some strings with that.
Yeah.
And I think the US is in a place to pull those strings when it needs to. And I hope that the Trump administration, President Trump's not someone who's going to easily put up with bullshit. So I hope that there are levers that he'll pull without having to, it doesn't have to be a heavy lift.
Yeah. And doesn't need to be tiptoed around either.
No, let's be transparent about it.
Yeah. Has it gotten any better there, to your knowledge, since you've been there, or is it as bad as it's
as bad as it's always been? Yeah. Constantly I'm getting messages or I'm reading about just another attack here and these, these awful places, these border displacement areas where people are living. I admire people that can live there for months, years on end. There's no education for the children, except some ad hoc community leaders will try to run small classrooms. There's no electricity, so of course you've got no refrigeration. I think I had to walk up to a medical clinic and try to charge my phone for an hour once a day that had a generator, but there's no widespread use of generators. You're sleeping on a floor. I remember there was a mosquito net with all holes in it. I thought, well, this isn't going to do much. But you're lucky just to have that mosquito net. You're showering with a bucket of water. There's no sanitation. It's a tough environment to be in, and just the strength of people to be able to do that is just that in itself, to survive. And a lot of the time with the women, they're widows, their husbands were killed, their sons were killed. A lot of them, again, in these really challenging environments, are raising 8 children, and they get on with it. And that, to me, it's an incredible reminder of just ordinary people, just the ability to be extraordinary in this way. Like, I'm in awe of just, they've got a child strapped to their back, they're hard laboring, the women are out there, they've got, very, very few food resources, and they just get on with it. And to me, that's like an incredible part of humanity.
There seems to be that kind of recurring theme in all of these areas of the caliber and magnitude of resilience that exists in kind of ordinary, everyday citizens of these countries being forced into those positions.
It is. And yeah, I always walk away so many mixed emotions, but one of them, and maybe that's just the optimist in me, is always trying to find a silver lining somewhere, in the darkest places. But yeah, it is. It's the ability of what humans can withstand that is an incredible reminder. A reminder to myself when I'm having my own moments of self-pity, first world problems, whatever it may be, and being just like, just get it together. Come on, Yeah. And I think that's also been a help for me in motherhood too, because, there are days where it's, I don't have family or any outside care, so I'm trying to work, I'm trying to, do it all, plus take care of my daughter. And then you get on Instagram, the algorithm, once you've been searching anything motherhood, the algorithm wants to tell you how hard it is. And I'm not taking away from, many women's experiences, that it can be incredibly challenging, I'm sure, with multiple children in many situations. But I have to find myself going, okay, just stop. And all of this stop, because go and talk to that mother that is at that camp on the Sudan-Chad border that has lost her husband, that has 8 children, her son's been killed, she's got 2 kids with malaria, she's pregnant, she's had a stillborn, and we forget many women are still dying in childbirth in these parts of the world too. So just being pregnant is a risky situation. Maybe she's survived, sexual violence. She's got barely any food, and yet, she's figuring out how to make a bag of beans as calorically dense as possible, and she's putting sugar in it and oil in it and everything she can find. And she's got no running water. She's got, nothing. And it's this blistering heat, and you don't hear her complain once. That is hard. My life with my air conditioning and trying to balance the day, and by comparison, that's not hard. So it does put things in perspective for me a lot.
How long were you there for?
My last trip, I was there for 3 weeks.
I'm curious. I know we talked a little bit about your trips to Afghanistan, but I'm always curious, from a loadout standpoint, how do you prepare for a trip knowing that you're basically you're gonna be mobile for several weeks in a place with very little resources? You're gonna have to carry everything. How do you pack for that? What do you bring with you?
Yeah, so lucky this case, I was with friends of mine, incredible friend of mine. He's at a wonderful NGO, Sudan Sunrise. It's a very small NGO, but he spent a fair bit of time sort of in the region. So that made it much easier because I wasn't totally just going in and winging it. My first time.
A loadout list of who?
Yeah, so he's able to tell me what the things that he said. My last trip I needed XYZ, didn't need it this time. So, don't recommend taking this, but let's take this. And we were able to, decide, what he could take, what I could take, and I think just kind of work it from there. So it's always good to have, someone that's already spent a lot of time in that region to at least advise you if they can't obviously be there themselves, then really you've got to seek the advice of people who've done it before you. Otherwise, you can be taking a whole bunch of stuff you don't know. And so in this case, he said to me, in his last trip, he said, I took a bunch of MREs last time, didn't really use it, didn't really need it. So, okay, I was trying to pack as light as possible too, because moving around in cars, if you're away during the day, I didn't take computers or anything that, going to be valuable because, I'm leaving, my stuff exposed for a lot of the day. So you've got to think about kind of just strategically. You take a wash bag with soap because I know I'm not going to be washing my clothes necessarily, except for, in the shower is how I'm going to have to figure out how to do it. And then, thankfully, we did take our own mosquito nets because after a couple of nights of realizing why I was waking up, and not sleeping, it was, big holes in the bottom. So take your own if you can. But just kind of figuring out those things. And then, in terms of food, we were able to, pay to get people at the house that were able to just make beans. That's the other thing too, don't go to these places with any dietary restrictions. Don't go
is that gluten-free?
Don't ask if it's vegan. Don't tell them, I'm a carnivore, I'm whatever. Just eat what you're given. And so that's kind of the approach I take. And there's not much. I mean, you're lucky to eat maybe once or twice a day, but
before you go, are you loading up on anti-malaria prophylactics and stuff like that?
Yes, that's really important. Absolutely. I certainly wouldn't have survived.
Is there a whole host of other inoculations that you're getting?
No. I mean, I've had I'm pretty up to date with, the yellow fever and things like that from prior trips to Africa. But malaria is the big one there because that's something that you will get. Yeah. Pretty much. And everyone I talked to, in fact, this beautiful translator, a young guy, and he was sweetest, but one day we were doing interviews and he, would always wear this lovely, plaid top, the only thing he had, and always trying to look his best. He's, poor guy living in this camp, always was trying to look his best. And then one day we're doing interviews and he's asleep on the ground and he'd rolled up his shirt and I see he's got a drip in his arm. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, just malaria, it's just everybody gets it. You know, it's like the flu, basically. You're going to get it a couple of times a year, and you just got to keep getting on with it, even though you're terribly sick from it. And that's the way that life is. And so, it's.
So what are the 3 must-haves for a 3-week backpacking trip in Sudan?
Malatrone, which is the malaria medication that I took. That's definitely a must-have, because just the malaria rates in that part of the world are, I think, really I think the highest in the world. So definitely take that. Definitely take your mosquito net, and if you've got sunscreen, which thankfully, you know, we'd always joke in the Delphorians would say, well, at least we don't need that. And just like,
There's probably not a lot of that available there, I imagine.
Yeah, no, there isn't. And this is surprisingly, even just to go and get insect repellent. You know, I was in N'Djamena, which is the capital of Chad, before I went down to the border area, and just the repellent I brought was, you know, more natural, and I was like, you know what, I'm going for the DEET stuff. We're going, and just to find that was really a challenge. So take your mosquito repellent. Maybe you have to make that 4 things.
You want the full CNS disruptor DEET stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that's terrible, but it works. Clothes wise, I mean, do you bring like multiple changes of clothes, or are you really only bringing like 1 or 2? Or?
I'm someone who packs so light, so I take again as little as I possibly can, just for mobility reasons. So I do take, you know, maybe 4 or 5 things, and I just keep washing them.
Footwear wise.
Birkenstocks. I mean,
really?
I have my running shoes. You know, I use them, but I wore Birkenstocks. I was like, well, I'm not in like a frontline, you know, combat situation where I'm going to need like a good pair of boots. So in this case, just as light. And why I love Birkenstocks, and I will always love Birkenstocks, is I've never had a blister from Birkenstocks. I've had a blister from every other flip-flop, Havaiana, whatever you want to call it, or I buy just a brand new pair of Skechers or something. I will always get a blister. I've never had a blister from Birkenstocks.
Are you going full-blown Western tourist with socks and sandals? Or are you going
No.
I'd be afraid for the mosquito bites in your feet.
Yeah, I do spray, and I do put a sunscreen too on my feet. But I can't do the socks and Birkenstocks. That's just not going to happen.
I'm a dad, so I have to rock it. Basically, it's kind of a rule. Is there a single creature comfort that you bring that's non-essential that you bring just to have?
I guess my Apple iPods, you know, to have music, audiobooks, especially a lot of the time, because you are traveling through, not that I even, in my head, I thought, I'm going to listen to all of these books or read this, or I downloaded a bunch on Kindle. I never really touched any of it because the driving is so horrific. I mean, through these, like, I can't tell you the amount of times we were stuck in sand in the middle of the night trying to get villagers to help us, because the driver said he had a 4-wheel drive and he didn't. So that was problematic. But I think my headphones will always be my creature comfort, because that way I can kind of escape. I can have my little self-escape from the world, or if I'm lying in it was interesting, like lying in bed at night when you don't have internet, you don't have lights, you don't have electricity, and it gets dark very early there, and then it gets really light at like 5 a.m. So, but the sun's going down early, and then you've got nothing to sort of do at night because you can't go out anywhere. It's not safe, and there's nowhere to go out. You're in, you know, these villages, and just lying there going, oh my gosh, like I actually have nothing to do. Like, this is a weird feeling. And I didn't want, by the time I'd be in my mosquito net, I didn't want to get out again, just the risk of anything coming in. So you just have to, you kind of just sit with it. And it's a time to reflect, but also, that time just to have me time.
Yeah. Comms wise, are you guys bringing sat phones or relying on local networks? I mean, how are you?
I do have a sat phone. I never had to use it. Surprisingly, it's one thing I'll say that was incredible is, and I was, journeying 30 hours from, N'Djamena down, and I barely lost my cell reception, in my, so for all this, and it's a very, very, very developing country here. But I'll say whoever set up that, their cell towers have done a pretty interesting job, because I was able to, stay in comms pretty much for most of it. Intermittent times where it was in and out, but yeah, I did, always kind of felt that I had a route out, and then obviously I always have a satellite phone just as a backup.
Yeah. Is there a grossest thing that you ate while you were there? And anywhere you've been, I guess both.
Oh my gosh, this, I say again, goes back to, I remember just eating the pasta or something they cooked and the beans, same situation, and thinking, oh my God, this is a funny sweet taste. What is this? And then I found out they put sugar in it, because again, you put whatever you can into that meal to make it as dense. And they think, maybe adding the sweetness is going to make it more palatable, which for us is like, oh gosh, no. But for them, that's going to make the meal for them, and it's going to hopefully add to the calories that maybe they need to survive. So that was not my favorite. And then, the meat I pretty much steered clear from, because without refrigeration, you're not going to be eating like beef or anything like that, because there's nowhere to refrigerate. So they'll tend to slaughter smaller animals. There's a lot of lamb, chickens. But yeah, just once you spend time and you've just kind of gone through those markets, and it's not the most appetizing thing. You see that in a lot of, parts of the developing world. And that's just, again, coming from a privileged Western lens, I'll stick to the more like fried potato or something that's going to be a little safe. But I did have one horrible experience, I would say, because I'm such a horse lover and I love horses and I think they're so magical. And I think I was in Uzbekistan once and someone had ordered something and I thought it was like a sort of a sashimi piece almost. And I ate it. I was like, oh my God, that's the most disgusting. What is that? It was sour. It was gross. And then I found out it was horse meat, and I had to go to the bathroom and was like, I was just sick.
Yeah.
The idea of that. I recommend do not eat horse meat. It's disgusting, and it's not.
I know a lot of places do.
We still, in the U.S., a lot of American horses are still slaughtered for
their meat.
For these quote unquote delicacies in foreign places. It's gross. And
Numbers wise, going back to the Darfur, Sudan region, do you know what the statistics are from a genocide standpoint?
I think the last that I'd read, that was going back sort of last year. I mean, you're looking at somewhere between 300,000 or more people that had been killed, and then goodness knows how many more casualties on top of that. Yeah, wow. So it's huge. And I mean, you're talking about entire cities that are completely displaced of people, like just burning down every home, just running people out because they want to sort of take over that land. The militias have the capacity to take over that land.
Do you feel that it's largely based on religion, or is it more tribal?
This is not religion. This is, I mean, essentially it's Muslims killing Muslims. This is Arabs against Africans. And this is the other part that doesn't maybe get acknowledged in the media. This is a racial war. As I said, this is Arabs against Africans. This doesn't get attention.
Which group is which?
The RSF, the militias, they're Arabs, and the Africans are the tribes. Yeah, okay. The mass elite.
So the predominant atrocities are being committed by the Arabs on the Africans. Are there cases of the reverse?
Of course, there's nothing again that fits squarely into a box, and there's certainly atrocities that have been committed on the other side too. It goes back to that lopsided equation, though. So
it's way lopsided.
Yes, yeah. You've got the RSF that are the ones that are committing the bulk of horrific crimes. Not to say the other side isn't, because there are many cases of that happening. It's just nothing on the scale of what we're seeing. So it is a racial war, and it should be framed that way, because that's really what it is. And I don't see any protests, on behalf of those tribes. That there's no one at campus that's like, trying to raise awareness of their particular plight.
Yeah. There's no free Darfur signs at Columbia.
Yeah, I mean, it galvanized quite a bit of attention
years ago. I
Yeah,
remember.
2004. George Clooney, all these celebrities kind of involved, but you don't hear those voices anymore.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I think they've probably moved their attention to other things. Maybe there is just a certain degree of frustration, I think, that can happen when you keep seeing these things happen. And then, you've dedicated yourself to, trying to build awareness or stop it. And then it happens again. And there's frustration, I think, that naturally as human beings we have with that. But it's still something I've tried to piece together why we don't hear voices about it. And you could say that for a lot of places in the world. You don't hear, big celebrity voices coming out over the longest running war, which is what's happening in Burma or Myanmar. That never ended since the Second World War, and the atrocities there against by this Buddhist army against women. You've got the same situation of sexual violence, and you have the Rohingyas, which garnered a lot of attention several years ago. They are the Muslim minority in Burma that a lot of them have been sort of run out of the country, but you're not seeing that. Few people have awareness that this war is still going on, that you have this Burmese army, the Tatmadaw, that is just bulldozing lands, dropping bombs wherever they can. They're supported by Russia and China, and again committing these horrible atrocities. But that's not galvanizing populations either. And there are so many of these things I can rattle off. What's happening in China with the Uyghurs, like just so many. But we don't know they're happening because they're not necessarily garnering front page news, and editors look at that and think, well, maybe it's not a sell. So from my perspective as a freelance reporter, it's tough because you want to bring awareness to these things, but if it's not sort of the flashbang what everyone wants to hear about,
it's not going
it's not going to make any money, and unfortunately that media is just, it's a money making beast is what it is, and that doesn't always lend itself to giving the most full coverage possible.
Yeah. One of the big reasons I wanted to bring you on was talking about some of these fentanyl-based weapons that Iran has been developing, and you've gotten, quite a bit of exposure or knowledge through different sources to that. I would love for you to kind of speak to your findings in that regard and talk about it, because it's something that I've not seen really at all in the media, with very little exception.
Yeah, there's very little has been written about it. It is very much a developing story. West Point has actually written a little bit about it, and a few think tanks, but it's not something that's garnered a lot of attraction. But something I've been following, and that is the potential, high potential of Iran having developed fentanyl-based PBAs, pharmaceutical-based agents that it can then put in grenades or artillery, or use that, give it to its proxies. There's no evidence yet to say that anything like that has been used per se, but certainly having the potential to do that, I think, should be a huge cause for concern. Yeah. Backpedaling a little bit. So fentanyl typically comes from factories in China. I think we've seen a little bit more evidence of it coming potentially from India now too, now that China has basically had its hand forced to do some level of crackdown. But it's very cheap, synthetic, so very easy to access. Of course, Iran has good relations with China, so it's not hard for them to be able to use some of these, and they're oftentimes they are legitimate, this is a legitimate pharmaceutical product. And that's what makes it very difficult to put a stop to, is because there are very valid uses for it. But that drug is different when it's used sort of in this context. So very easy to get, very cheap to get. I think there's been a lot of concern that Iran is very clever. It's a society that's very creative. It's been sanctioned for a long time. It has an ability to work that around and puts majority of its money not into helping, poor people. It puts it into military endeavors. So I think that the idea that they have likely potentially developed this is a big cause for concern, because again, it's very cheap, very easy to administer. It has the ability, depending on how it's used, to incapacitate or to kill. And fentanyl is obviously very deadly, to kill mass people. And of course, US has as many soldiers and presence in the Middle East, maybe not in a quote unquote combat scenario really anymore, except for a few thousand people in Iraq and Syria. But that's something very easy for Iran to incapacitate a huge group of people, especially if it is in the hands of any of its proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, or you've got Hezbollah or Hamas or any of these groups. And that could be, sort of a massive advantage that it would have. Obviously, it's a violation of the 1997 against chemical weapon convention, which Iran is a signatory of. The United States is also a signatory of. And I believe we depleted our entire stockpile, I think it was by 2023. So, that's not something that the US is going to be deploying anytime soon. But again, it's very difficult because this is a product that is legitimately used. And so it's very hard to put a stop to supply when it is something that is a requirement for legitimate medical purposes.
The most troubling aspect of this whole thing is when you think about the mechanism with which it's deployed, it opens up this Pandora's box of capability to administer it in ways that really I don't think a lot of people understand. Because if you think about, and I've seen some rumblings online of some reports of things being developed. I'm A, curious if you've seen the same thing, or B, if you've even heard of any of it. But like getting into water supplies, dumping bags of pure powder into water supplies could kill thousands of people using drones, right? Is that the, say a 5-pound sack of flour on a DJI $300 from Best Buy drone being dispersed in high winds above a huge crowd of people at a parade, a sporting event, a concert, what have you, same thing. So I think historically the comfort that a lot of Americans take in, it's difficult to get high explosives into this country or to even source them in this country. That's a harder lift or a heavier lift if that has to be the initiator, because to me, attaching fentanyl into grenades or other explosives, can increase the capacity, but you don't need to.
You don't, absolutely. And it's a very cheap, a very efficient, very, in many ways, undetectable way to inflict a lot of damage. It's not on the scale of, a lot of the nerve agents, but it's going to, it's much easier to deploy something like that than it is, as you said, to sort of go through the rigmarole of getting a lot of these other, toxic chemicals together. And again, it's you go south of the border and it's not hard to get a whole bunch of it if anybody wanted to do that. And it is a cause for concern that I think hasn't got a lot of attention that I would hope intelligence communities and people in these positions of power are aware of and keeping tabs on. And it's not that you can necessarily do anything about it while it's in Iran right now, but certainly having an awareness of is that being distributed to proxies that will therefore, inflict on civilian populations or, U.S. and its allied personnel.
Yeah. Have you seen, from a platform standpoint of what's being developed from an Iranian state-sponsored standpoint?
I can't, I guess, probably speak to the intricacies of that, other than, from what I've heard, from what I've understood from sources who I think have pretty good knowledge of this, is that it's certainly it's something that is in progress. It's something that hasn't necessarily been deployed, but it's certainly it's a tool in the arsenal.
Because they're signatories on that pact or treaty or what have you, if Iran as a state used that in that capacity, would that, to your knowledge, be a game changer in terms of our response?
That's really hard to say if we would actually do anything or not. I mean, I don't think you can rely on these, United Nations or international bodies to necessarily do anything. Yes, maybe come out and condemn it, but I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to stop it? You're not. You don't have that capacity. So that would be on something, that would be on the United States to put a stop to that.
Yep.
Whether that is, I don't know how willing the American public is to going into any sort of direct confrontation with Iran. But I think there are a few choices, especially with Iran. I know President Trump's been talking about, he's going to do a better deal. And, we all know the president loves deals. I think Iran is one of those situations that I don't know you're going to get a deal out of, or anything you think is going to be adhered to or fair. I think that, that is sort of, Iran is a wild beast, and I don't know that sitting down with, the mullahs is going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to me, I think they really only understand one thing, and that's pressure/violence.
Yeah. You got to speak to them in the language that they know.
In terms of your sources, I know you can't reveal them, but I'm curious, like in terms of the credibility. I mean, can you say whether or not they are, intelligence government sources that are verifying this information? Like,
it's people with knowledge, I guess, of the situation, and it's always, it's a challenge to always be in, because unless you're seeing things firsthand, it is hard to trust any source in any situation, whether that be in Washington D.C. or in any country, and people have their own interpretation. So I am always very careful and very skeptical in the way I phrase things. Again, my understanding that this is something in development, not something that's used. Can that be, misconstrued for something that's a legitimate medical purpose? Sure. But I think it doesn't hurt to have an awareness that this is a possibility. And what is our plan to mitigate that possibility?
Right.
I certainly can't, sit here and say this is 100% happening and this is where it is, because I'm not there. I'm not on the ground. I'm not seeing it with my eyes. But I think the only way that you can, in any way mitigate these things is recognize them as a possibility that can possibly happen. And what mechanisms do we have to fighting against that? I mean, Iran has hacked our water supply before. It was around Thanksgiving of 2023 that they infiltrated several small towns. I think it was, I'd have to go back to my notes, but I want to say Pennsylvania. I'd have to double check. And a couple of other places where it was sort of like a test run, and it very much got swept under the rug too. There were some local reports about it. I did some more digging on it, with some sort of private intelligence groups that gave me really good information. There wasn't any great media that was interested in it. I ended up writing about it on my Substack, why I love Substack, because you have some independence. But I was shocked that there wasn't an interest in that. To me, that was a massive breach. I mean, this was, nothing bad had happened. Nobody was hurt. But that's a test run.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very blatant. And it was directly pinpointed at groups within Iran that were, under the subject of the government. And this was happening in U.S. soil. And I think at the time, we were more absorbed with, whatever was flashy headline news. And I think that is also part of the problem. The news cycle is you're often missing these underlying things that are happening because we're so drawn in by whatever the big flashy thing happening is that we kind of miss the underlying picture.
Yeah. I mean, that's a proven capability, and we basically did nothing about it.
Absolutely. I mean, and China does these things every day.
Yeah.
And what do we do about it? Not a lot.
Yeah. Do you know, or are you aware of any other pharmaceutical compounds that they're experimenting with, or is it purely fentanyl?
There is, I can never pronounce the name. It starts with M. I'd have to, I'm butchering the name, but I know that there is another sort of synthetic that that's been widely used too, again, to incapacitate.
Yeah.
It's a sedative.
Oh, okay. Do you think that fentanyl should be classified as a MWD? Or a WMD, sorry.
That's hard because it's got legitimate pharmaceutical purposes.
Yeah, I guess you really couldn't.
I just think, it's hard because it is used, legitimately in, almost every hospital in America. So I don't know how you could differentiate always, what is being used legitimately and what is not.
I guess, the First, let me slap myself for making that mistake. I'm so hardwired for military working dogs. I said MWD instead of WMD. But
It's all right. I knew what you mean. It's all good.
just making sure everybody else before you butcher me in the fucking comments.
But it is. I mean, it is a big problem. I mean, we keep hearing fentanyl over the years. It's a big problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess I would look at the parallel being nuclear material. You know, it's used in power plants. It's used in even medical applications.
Yeah.
It's still considered a WMD. So maybe there's a way to
work around what
maybe in certain amounts it classifies.
Yeah, how it's sort of chemically used, or I guess anything used outside of. And this is the problem that happens, with China, with Mexico, with a lot of it is a lot of the, illicit fentanyl that is coming through and killing a lot of people. It's not always coming through, again, these illicit networks. It's oftentimes, it's very entwined with legitimate businesses and legitimate pharmaceutical businesses. And sometimes, that's why it's such a problem, is because it's very hard to sometimes make that distinction.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, what the biggest challenge with ending that crisis is.
Yeah. From your knowledge of things that you've come across, I guess, source-wise, do you think that there's any way for us or individuals to prepare for an attack like that? Like, would Narcan and things like that be...
I'm a proponent of Narcan in general. Like, if you can have Narcan, you never know when you can save a life.
Yeah.
But I'm also at the same time hesitant to normalize anything like this, in the sense that there's so many threats that happen in the world. As we saw New Year's Eve in New Orleans, New Year's Day, a car can be an incredibly deadly a tool to kill a lot of people at once. So I'm always hesitant to I think there's awareness is good, but we can't live our lives walking around worrying about every threat that can potentially happen.
Yeah.
And that's part of the challenge of existing, is we put so much emphasis in the mental health and the wellness of others, essentially, around us.
Yeah.
To live through every day. We have to trust that, someone on the freeway is not going to be drunk and driving 100 miles an hour, or that some maniac's not going to be running around a shopping center with a knife, or, whatever it may be. We put so much trust into other people, and part of me, I think our nervous systems, to a large degree, are already so damaged from the news cycle and worrying about these things. I don't want to give anyone one more thing to worry about. So in Narcan, something very easy that, we can have potentially to save a life. But I think if you start to get too much into the weeds about the what ifs, sometimes, can drive us crazy. So I think it's important for leadership and lawmakers and people that are in positions of, mass kind of security powers to have certainly mitigation and awareness. I just don't know that we can all be wandering around figuring out, what we're going to do if that happens.
Yeah. Obviously, the main source is coming from China or India or both, or maybe even other places. But a big component from a supply chain standpoint is from the southern border. Mm-hmm. Have you done much investigative work as to the flow of narcotics and specifically fentanyl?
Yeah, it's actually something I started working on many years ago before it was like a trendy thing. And my next trip, I'm doing, more work on that. Specifically with cartels. It's something I'm planning for March. But yeah, so basically you had sort of these, I guess, and they weren't directly affiliated with Beijing, but nothing happens without a certain degree of knowledge from Beijing. So you have these sort of groups in Mexico that are kind of part of this supply chain in bringing these synthetics. I mean, they get in through open ports. There's so many ways that it happens. It's a giant open secret, so to speak. And the cartels can buy fentanyl very easily. It's a great filler for a lot of drugs, not just things like cocaine or heroin, but it can be put into black market pharmaceuticals. So I tell people I know a lot of people that, want to go over the border to get their pharmaceutical drugs because it is so cheap and you don't need a doctor's prescription for a lot of it. Just don't do it. Don't do it. The risk is too high. Don't order something from an online pharmacy that you don't know the origin, because this is a big problem. And I think it's been a misnomer when we talk about the opioid crisis in the United States. We say overdose, and that's where things are confusing, because a lot of the times it's not overdose, it's a poisoning, because the tiniest amount, like a grain of salt, can potentially kill somebody, especially a child or someone with not the strongest constitution. So I think that that's been a misnomer, but it's a very easy process, to get those. It's a kind of just an entire mafia setup, so to speak. Yeah. It's not difficult. And so those precursors are easy to get. And again, it's the precursor chemicals. It's not coming in as fentanyl already made. It's the chemicals that are needed come from China into Mexico. And it's up to, these sort of cartel cooks to then, put it together and use the tiniest amount to... and the demand is so high oftentimes for... Again, black market pharmaceuticals, drugs, wherever it may be, they don't care if they're killing 100,000 people a year. Like, you'd think, oh, isn't that killing your customer base? Not really. There's plenty more where that comes from. And this is like a very cheap way of filling the drugs that to them it's still a cost-effective equation. So it is a big problem, and it is coming in from our southern border, and it has been happening for many years. And I was always flabbergasted why it wasn't more of a crisis than it was, given the numbers and the people that it was killing. And I know they said the numbers have gone down slightly in the last year. Whatever, it's still very high. And I think that is an important thing that needs to be addressed. And, I'm hoping that we will start to see real progress on that, because that is, it's a huge killer to young Americans. I mean, sometimes you've got people one group of people that, an entire group at a party might be wiped out from it. And again, it's a lot of the time, it happens everywhere, but a lot of the time it's in flyover areas, places that aren't New York or LA or DC. So it's not necessarily front and center with the news. But I belong to, several groups on the internet, and just every day, parents are posting pictures of their children. In many cases, it's children that may have gone down the route of addiction, and then it's that one time you relapse, and that one time you take that whiff of cocaine that is laced with fentanyl, whatever it may be. It's terrifying. I think, when you were growing up, when I was growing up, people are, could experiment with drugs a little bit if they wanted to. That wasn't ever my thing, but certainly people around me, it was the day of the ecstasy. And chances are you could do that and you're going to be okay. These days, and what scares me, especially, again, being a mom, there's no room for experimentation anymore. And so that is terrifying. And I think that is, a big part of what we're seeing in the crackdown on the southern border. Many different things, but I think that has to be a huge part of it. And having said that, we also need to look inward. What is driving this demand? You can't just blame the supply chain. We have to look at, there would be no supply if there wasn't demand. So where is this demand coming from? Who is affected by it? And take an inward look as well. That I think sometimes it's easy to blame every other country, but we have to take a look at ourselves too.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. What's your take on Trump's crackdown of the border to address that? You think it's going well? Do you think it's...
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it hasn't really started yet. I guess he threatened the tariffs. Mexican president, was able to put that on hold and say, we're going to deploy 10,000 more troops. That already happened. So I don't know if those troops had left or if they're still there and this is 10,000 more, or it's just bolstering the 10,000 that were already there. Let's give it a go. Let's see if that works. Part of me is not quite sure it does. And I feel for a lot of the Mexican law enforcement because they're paid terribly. They often don't have great weaponry. They're maybe, I remember speaking to one Mexican soldier on a trip and he was like, well, yeah, you get like 4 rounds of a 9mm handgun, you're up against a cartel that has military grade weapons. Like, what are you going to do? So, there are oftentimes, they're putting their lives in the line too. Sure, yes, it also is very corrupt. You have times where law enforcement's there, a cartel is going to come into a community and say, you're going to take this money or else I'm going to kill you. Before I kill you, I'm going to kill your family. I'm going to cut their heads off in front of you and you're going to sit there and watch. What do you do with that? So I do feel like there's a lot of, finger pointing at the Mexican law enforcement. I think they're in a very difficult position. So I would like to see, them being in a better position to be able to have a fair fight back, because I don't think that is necessarily happening. I think we have to look at what is happening in this quote-unquote war on drugs that's been happening for decades now, since President Nixon. Is it working? What do we need to do differently? And you can go two routes with it. There's obviously people that will say, well, let's legalize everything. And the other people are like, no, we need to go harder. And that's where you've got the other train of thought, well, let's designate it terrorists. Let's, go harder with these arrests. And they're two very different things. I think we've seen in Oregon, the legalization of drugs hasn't worked out well.
Yeah.
I think, so that's a hard argument to kind of make at this point. When it is so accessible to people, you do run the risk then, obviously, of people going, well, I'm just going to give this a go then, because that's like walking into a liquor store. So it's going to be interesting to see the approach that the Trump administration, which certainly seems like it's going to take a much more hardline approach maybe than in the past. Maybe I think in a lot of these cases, things get worse before they get better. And I think that's probably a lot of what we're going to see. I want to see something done on the fentanyl, though. I think that there has to be a way to be able to control what's coming in and out of the country.
Yeah. Fascinating discussion. What's next for you?
What's next for me? Always cooking something. So I think my next project that I've kind of been working on is looking at border situations, cartels. I'm very interested in and working on some book project again. A very interest in maternal mortality, the way that wars impact mothers as well. I think that's just a story that hasn't really been told in different places. And so I'm very interested about documenting those and telling those kind of personal experiences. And I sort of think with that, sort of working on a book project with that, but also looking at, I think, for lack of a better word, again, it's not the most, popular, politically correct thing to explore, but I think if we want to make real change in places in the world, you have to look at boys and boys' education. A lot of these are patriarchal societies, in developing world. I think we put a lot of attention into girls' education and girls' empowerment and all of those things are great, important. But I think if we want to instill real change in the way that, women are respected in places, that things that we talked about earlier, the sexual violence, that those things aren't happening, we have to look about, what is it that needs to change, and that is boys' education. And so that's something else that I'm sort of exploring for a project, and always open to whatever seems that is underreported, I guess, is my passion, and that's just not only overseas but very much here too. I did some work with Hurricane Helene, and I continue to kind of follow up on that because I think that it's easy to forget things when they aren't in the news cycle. But there is so much, right here at home that is important. And again, being a mom, I'm home more than I used to be. And so I have to find things that I think are important to highlight while I'm here too. Still trying to make independent journalism work. It's not always easy because, again, it is a polarizing world. Certain publications recognize they have a certain audience and need to toe a certain line, and I'm not in a political box. I try to take things issue by issue and break it down to, where I see the best of the worst decisions. Yeah. But yeah, I'm still going at it as much as I can, and try to explore to maybe some different platforms too, aside from just writing.
Yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure having you. I'm sure we'll have you back again for another update after, a few more of your projects. So always a treat. I do have some parting gifts that you didn't get last time. Thanks to
you.
John Johnston and Champion Choice Silver. You got the
Oh, wow,
Standard
that's
Challenge
great.
coin.
Yes, we have a good coin collection at home, so.
And then now, since you're attending
Wow.
a Texas rodeo, you'll have
I know,
a
my
belt buckle too.
first Texas rodeo. I definitely have to wear that. That's great.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
yeah, again, thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of your even busier schedule now to share your insight with us. It's always fascinating, so I appreciate it.
Anytime. Can't wait to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To the listener, thank you for the support. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you didn't, you can choke yourself. And until next time, this is Mic Drop.